I hope that you'll realize that the starting point, something that even Israel claims for their own existence, is the right to self-determination. The right to self-determination means that the indigenous people living in an area, at least since 1928, and for better or for worse, 1928 is sort of the cutoff point, because before that time, at least according to international law, somebody could take another country from somebody by force. International law did not prohibit the acquisition of territory of another country by force. But from that time, it's unambiguous. Any government in the world would admit that international law prohibits you from taking another country by force. In fact, oddly enough, when Britain occupied Palestine after the First World War, they probably could have annexed Palestine to Britain. It would have been somewhat odd, but they've done it elsewhere. They didn't do that. In fact, they said, we do not want to control this territory. We will turn it over. They tried. If you look at Palestinian history, they made a good effort to try to do that. They even sent a governor general there who was a Zionist who tried to do that, and he was sort of booted out by the indigenous population within a few months. But they tried to annex it and weren't able to do that, and decided we will submit to at that time, the League of Nations, and allow them to take responsibility for this territory. And the League of Nations decided that the British would hold it in trust for the people that live in that territory. In other words, after being a conqueror, if you will, they gave up their right to that territory. Under international law existing at that time, that meant that the indigenous people had the right to that territory. I would argue they had it before, but without any doubt, even if you take the most conservative view of international law, the indigenous people had the right to that territory. And this was not a new idea. This is what, in fact, in the 1920s and again in 1947 and 1948, this is what the Arabs almost unanimously argued. They were outnumbered in the United Nations, but they had law on their side. They argued that Palestine, under the mandate, should be decided, what happens to that area should be decided by the Palestinian people. That, to this day, has never happened. They have never asked the Palestinian people, the indigenous people living there, whether they want to form a Jewish state, whether they want to form an Arab state, what they want to do. And that is a quite large defect in international law that is still existing and has never been changed. Let me move, though, a bit forward to more contemporary events, because I just put that in the back of your mind, because that's really what has caused these problems. We have this ongoing problem in Palestine because the Palestinian people have never been given the right to decide their own fate, and that is something that is agreed to by the consensus of the international community as a point of international law, but you might say more generally just as the agreement of everybody in the international community. What happened the last few days is just a reflection of that. First, you may know that many of these boats have gone, some of them, or I should say, have gone to Gaza before. There have been several trips there. And all of them clearly stated to the Israeli authorities that they were carrying humanitarian assistance. They stated it to such an extent that when they all docked in Cyprus, they were controlled. So the Israelis knew what they were carrying in those boats. Secondly, any boat is able to travel on the high sea as long as it's registered, arguably even if it's not registered anywhere. These boats were all registered and traveling on the high sea. And as you just heard by the last two speakers, when a boat is on the high seas, it is one of the main principles of international law that protects boats against piracy. No state is allowed to, or any private individual for that matter, can board a boat without the permission of the people controlling that boat. In fact, if somebody tries to board the boat, even if it's a police force, on the high seas, the people on the boat can use force legally to repel them. So, if the people on the flotilla had arms and had fired at the Israeli soldiers, that would not have been a violation of international law. They would have been acting within their rights. Furthermore, not only do you have international law applying to the high seas in this situation, but you also have international humanitarian law. Most of you have heard of the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions apply to any situation of war or to occupation. In this case, Palestine is clearly occupied. The United Nations has adopted more than 100 resolutions that reiterate that under international law, Palestine, including Gaza to this day, the UN has never said otherwise, is occupied territory. When you are living in occupied territory, you have a right to receive humanitarian assistance, and according to Article 23 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, people have the right to deliver humanitarian assistance to you. The only thing that the occupying power can do, which Israel initially claimed they were doing, is that they can exercise the right to control to ensure that's humanitarian assistance. But because that was already done, they had no right to do it in this case. And if they did that, in any case, it would only be at the border of the occupying territory, or the occupied territory, not on the high seas. So what they did there was clearly illegal under international law, by even the most conservative understanding of international law, in at least those two contexts. Also, when you use force against any individual, even when the police use it here in New York City, they are limited in the amount of force that they can use against individuals. They're only allowed to use force that allows them, or that is necessary, to achieve lawful ends. In this case, the ends were unlawful, of boarding a ship on the high seas, so no force would have been allowed. But even if it had been in, for example, the territorial waters of Israel, they would not have been able to use excessive force, such as they did by shooting on these people. And we have videos of them shooting on that, using percussion bombs, and in some cases perhaps using even grenades against some of these ships. That is clearly excessive use of force, and that is of course a violation of the right to life, the right to humane treatment. You can also not detain people without allowing them legal process. In this case, as you know, most of these people have been held without access to lawyers, some with limited access to lawyers, but most of them without any access to lawyers, and none of them have yet been brought before a court. That is clearly a violation of the right to security of person and due process. So there are numerous violations of international law that are very clear in this situation to any international lawyer, including Israeli international lawyers, some of them who have recognized these violations of international law when they've been interviewed even on Israeli television, although then they're played down very much.